So first, a statement from Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Quote, "We have decided to bring our team home from Doha for consultations after the latest response from Hamas, which clearly shows a lack of desire to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. This week, the United States is advancing a bold and proactive foreign policy that reflects our enduring commitment to peace and security and prosperity for the American people. Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources Michael Regas is traveling to Seoul and Manila to strengthen the department's operational posture and deepen our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, a region central to America's strategic and economic interests. His visit builds on the administration's vision of a free, open, and secure Indo-Pacific. As the White House announced earlier this week, the United States is making significant progress on 3 major trade initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, reflecting our deep commitment to advancing economic prosperity and long-term security across the region. President Trump announced a landmark economic agreement with Japan, one of our closest allies and most important trading partner, and one of our most important trading partners. This historic deal underscores the enduring strength of the U.S.-Japan relationship and advances the mutual interests of both nations. The United States and Indonesia also reached a framework for negotiating an agreement on reciprocal trade. This framework is an important step toward expanding bilateral economic ties and will help unlock new opportunities for exporters in both countries. And on Tuesday, President Trump welcomed President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. of the Philippines to Washington. During the visit, the United States and the Philippines concluded a trade agreement that will reduce tariffs and expand market access, further deepening our economic partnerships with a key ally. Together, these agreements highlight the United States' sustained leadership in the region and our strong partnership with Indo-Pacific allies and partners.
Special Envoy's statement, does that suggest that the U.S. is pulling out of any sort of negotiating role in the Gaza ceasefire talks? What are these alternatives?
Well, look, ultimately the statement speaks for itself, but the question has never been our commitment to a ceasefire. The question has been Hamas's commitment to a ceasefire, and that has been made clear by the Special Envoy's statement. The fact that we have entered in good faith in trying to reach an end to this conflict. And as the Special Envoy said, we remain dedicated to trying to see an end to this conflict.
Joe said yesterday that 21 children under the age of 5 were among those who died of malnutrition so far this year, and more than 100 organizations have called for the lifting of all restrictions on the flow of aid and all land crossings to be opened and the restoration of a UN-led humanitarian response. Given this decision today, is the U.S. considering any other steps to increase the flow of aid to Gaza? Are you talking with Israel about them taking any other steps? How do you move forward on the aid?
Well, look, ultimately what we have seen us do is the delivery of close to 90 million meals into Gaza during a war zone. The ability to deliver that aid in a way where it is not being looted by Hamas. That is what we have seen. We are, of course, aware, and of course we want to see end the devastation that has taken place in Gaza. That's why we have seen this commitment to get aid to the people who need it in a way where it is not weaponized by Hamas. That commitment remains. It is a commitment from President Trump and Secretary Rubio. That is why we have supported the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That is why we continue supporting the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That is why we've seen those 90 million meals being distributed. And that commitment, again, to making sure that aid is reaching the people of Gaza that need it. And the first victims of Hamas being the people of Gaza, as is demonstrated once again here.
Is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation a sufficient mechanism for delivering aid to Gaza? I mean, people are still starving to death. Is that enough in the U.S. opinion?
Well, as spokesperson Tammy Bruce has said from this podium before, it is never enough in a war zone. It is never enough. That is why we're committed to trying to get as much aid in as possible. That is why we worked for that ceasefire, because of what we are seeing. But aid needs to be delivered in a way where it is not being looted by Hamas. So of course, it is never enough in a war zone, but we're dedicated to getting as much aid into Gaza in a way where it reaches the people that need it as possible. And that's why we were working so hard for a ceasefire.
Okay. Doctors Without Borders, internationally known and working with the U.S. for decades, is urgently calling for help beyond the foundation, because 1 in 4 young children and pregnant women, they say, are malnourished, and that it is a policy of starvation. Acknowledging 90 million meals and the progress, quote unquote, but there is a whole area of Gaza that is not being served by that. People can't get to it. It's only in one region, in the south. And internationally, 28 countries, hundreds of aid organizations are calling for something more than that. there's been some acknowledgement from U.S. officials as well that there's real starvation. So is there any, now that the talks have collapsed and so that there's no immediate ceasefire that might relieve the pressure, is there any alternative that the State Department would begin looking at?
We are incredibly aware of the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening there. That is the dedication you have seen from the President, the dedication you've seen from Secretary Rubio. Every single day we have conversations here at the State Department, every single briefing we have conversations here about getting aid into Gaza. It is a dedication of this administration. That's why we've seen the 90 million meals, the support of that effort from this administration. So, of course, we want to see as much aid getting into Gaza as possible in a way that is not being looted by Hamas. And this mechanism, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, has been a way to do that. So we're calling for additional support of that foundation to deliver that aid.
Okay, let me ask you this other question, though, because there is a lot of reporting, New York Times and elsewhere, about planned cuts in PEPFAR going forward. Now, just last week, Republicans led the way on the Hill in carving out the clawback that was proposed in PEPFAR and in continuing the program and expanding it beyond some of the contracts that were frozen under DOGE. Can you give us an update, a status update on where the State Department's thinking is on PEPFAR going forward?
Well, Secretary Rubio has stated that PEPFAR is an important and life-saving program that will continue. That dedication continues. That has been clear from the Secretary. The Secretary has made that clear. I will take a step back when we're talking about aid programs in general. Part of the new vision of this administration when it comes to aid is looking at recipients of aid, or at least the communities, as allies and partners, not those that are dependent on this aid. And in the long term, working towards a scenario where we have the same needs being provided by local partners or other entities is part of that long-term effort when we're talking about aid in general. So PEPFAR, though, now is an important and life-saving program that will continue. Secretary Rubio has made that clear.
And just to quickly follow up, some countries have moved towards taking ownership, South Africa, for instance, countries that are capable, but in conflict zones like Haiti, like Sudan, like Southern Sudan, like Somalia, and several other countries involved. Is there a plan to continue it until countries can stand on their own 2 feet?
Well, look, what I can say now is that PEPFAR, as I just said, that important and life-saving program that will continue. That's what our policy currently is here. Again, talking about that longer term, when we're talking about aid in general, is when we're talking about those local institutions being able to fulfill a lot of those needs, looking at people as trade and allies, not as those that are dependent on aid. That's a broader aid vision that is from this administration, but when it comes to PEPFAR, as I said, that it will continue.
The United Nations Security Council yesterday, the US was isolated in its position when it comes to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, support for the GHF. We've had the UK Prime Minister in the last hour saying the situation in Gaza is unspeakable and indefensible. We've had more than 100 humanitarian aid agencies saying that this system is creating the conditions of starvation. You have desperate Israeli hostage families who have been for weeks pleading with the Prime Minister of their country to do this deal. The US is the only power that has the leverage and the pressure to try and make that happen from the Israeli side. There is clearly a gap between Israel and Hamas. It's been there for a long time. And there are Israeli families who will say that this is quibbling over a few meters of territory in Gaza. This is quibbling over the number of Palestinian prisoners to be released. And the US could put the pressure on to move these two sides closer together. And can you help us understand why at this moment, when you see the conditions on the ground in Gaza, with now mass starvation, the US is deciding this is the moment to walk away from these talks?
This is not a question of what the United States is doing. It's a question of what Hamas has done. This is a response to what Hamas has done continually.
But that's not actually the position of many of the Israeli hostage families.
Israel has long accepted the deal on the table, and Hamas has long rejected it. I mean, it's never been our commitment to a ceasefire. That's never been the question here. We have engaged in good faith to try to achieve a ceasefire. The question has always been with Hamas. That is where the question has been. That is where it remains. And the response we just saw from Special Envoy Witkoff is reflective of that. The question is with Hamas, not with the United States.
You also say that Hamas has broken the ceasefire. It was, in fact, the Israeli Prime Minister who broke the ceasefire on the 18th of March, this past March and so on. Hamas had, or at least from what we hear, by the interlocutors and so on, that Hamas has been more than willing and submitted many concessions and so on. So what is required of Hamas so the ceasefire can take effect as far as the United States is concerned?
Well, look, there has been conversations on this. I will not go into details of what those private diplomatic conversations have been, but what I can say is it is clear now from our perspective that Hamas does not appear to be coordinated nor acting in good faith. We have approached these conversations with good faith, as has been evident by our comments from this podium and other places, and it is clear now that Hamas has not been acting that way.
I asked in Tuesday's briefing about why Secretary Rubio is not pushing harder for the extradition of Akram al-Tamimi from Jordan. I was given a written answer by the State Department on that yesterday after you guys took it back. Basically said we continue to impress upon the government of Jordan to bring her to justice. President Trump said on day one, his executive order, American citizens come first in American foreign policy, American citizens. Secretary Rubio put out his 3 questions. Every dollar spent, every program has to answer in the affirmative one of 3 questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? I'm sure you have these memorized by heart. $1.5 billion of foreign aid to Jordan. How is it conceivable that Tamimi is still there and any of that falls under these dictates of what American foreign policy is supposed to be, with 3 dead Americans in Tamimi's hands?
Well, on your first point, I mean, to reiterate what we provided to you, the United States has continually emphasized to the government of Georgia the importance of holding Alman al-Tamimi, the convicted terrorist released by Israel in a 2011 prisoner swap, accountable in a U.S. court for her admitted role in a 2001 bombing in Jerusalem that killed 15 people, including 3 Americans. The United States continues to impress upon the government of Jordan that Tamimi is a brutal murderer who should be brought to justice.
It's not working.
Well, and on the point in terms of our foreign policy, the president has made clear, the secretary has made clear through their actions that America is coming first. We've seen that with the Americans that have been brought home. We see that with the pursuit of peace around the region. We see that with a policy that is about strengthening our industrial base and making sure that we are advancing those interests wherever possible. We are continually emphasizing to the government of Jordan the importance of this issue, though in terms of the 3 that you mentioned, safer, stronger, more prosperous, those are not slogans here. They are actions. Those are North Stars that we fulfill every single day to the best of our ability, making sure we're advancing the interests of the American people in absolutely every single way that we can.
So I know, to go back to Gaza, I know you all have said repeatedly that the situation and starvation that we're seeing is because Hamas is blocking progress, or you've said because the UN organizations aren't willing to work within the framework of GHF and then that Israel has set for aid distribution. We all acknowledge, obviously, that Israel controls Gaza's borders completely, and it is limiting food to the population because Hamas has not agreed to its terms. I know this question has been asked in many different ways. I'm going to try this way. To be clear, is the U.S. government okay with Israel allowing children and adult civilians to starve so long as Hamas and the UN refuse to play by Israel's rules for aid distribution?
I reject the premise of that question in terms of how that was set up. This
okay?
humanitarian catastrophe lies at the feet of Hamas, who could end this conflict today by releasing the hostages and laying down their arms. This is something that we have dedicated, the president and the secretary have been dedicated to getting as much aid as we can into Gaza in a way where it is not being looted by Hamas. We have been dedicated to getting those 90 million meals into Gaza in a way where it has not been looted by Hamas. We have been dedicated to getting aid into Gaza. It is something that the secretary and the president have talked about, worked for. These discussions of getting more aid into Gaza have been part of that ceasefire we are hoping for. But again, the blame of this lies at the feet of Hamas, and that is the fact of the matter.
The criticism against the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is controlled by Israel. It's designed by Israel, is controlled by Israel, and therefore is weaponizing the food against the Palestinians. Where before the creation of the GHF, it was 400 points where people can access the food. Yesterday, the Jordanians managed to get 110 aid trucks, including baby formula and including flour. They work with WFP and they work with the World Central Kitchen. So there's an alternative to the GHF Why can't the U.S. allow other countries to use this kind of method, especially in northern Gaza? Because the 4 points where the GHF is concentrated is in the south. So people from the north cannot come to the south. So why can you encourage this method?
I flat out reject your characterization of Israel weaponizing aid. The only entity that has been weaponizing aid has been Hamas. Through the looting of aid, the weaponization of this population.
Can you say both?
What we have seen is an effort from the United States government, like I said, to get 90 million meals into Gaza during a war zone. We saw efforts to get to a ceasefire that Hamas has decided not to act in good faith to achieve. That is the reality here, and we're continuing to try to get aid into a war zone that exists only because of Hamas. The war zone exists only because of Hamas, who could end the conflict tomorrow, who is weaponizing aid against the Gaza population. The first victims, as we've said, are the Gaza population.
Okay, I want to speak. I want to ask a question on behalf of journalists in Gaza. You and other spokespeople behind this podium, they always talk about the freedom of expression, the value of our work. Our correspondents, including my own of Al Arabiya and my colleagues of AFP and every other journalist in Gaza, are unable to do their job because they are starving. They don't have food. How can you allow this to happen? And you tell us and tell everybody else that the work of journalists is vital, especially in a war zone. And yet you're now saying that it's Hamas who's controlling the food, and therefore we can't do anything about these people.
What I'm saying is Hamas is...
How can you help them? How can you
what
help
I'm saying first on that
war
front,
zone?
in terms of the food, is that Hamas, through looting the food, has led to weaponization. They are weaponizing aid when they are able to. We have a system in place attempting to get as much aid into Gaza as possible in a way where it is not being looted by Hamas. That is the reality that we're seeing. That is the reality that we're pushing for, trying to get as much aid in there as we possibly can. Yeah.
And quickly, because I have something on Syria, but just, you keep referencing the 90 million meals. That's since May 27th for 2.1 million people. I think assessments suggest if that number needs to be closer to 350 million meals in order to get these people the food they need. So that's a big delta, obviously. What can be done short of assigning complete blame to Hamas? What can be done to improve GHF's ability to get food?
Well, from the beginning, when this started, we did see a ramp up in terms of the food that they've been able to deliver. We also saw efforts from this administration, support for this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And the hope is that we'll have other entities supporting this mechanism as well, so that we can deliver as much food as possible. It will never be enough. We're working every day to get as close as possible, but it will never be enough because of the situation on the ground. That is not an excuse, but that is the reality we are dealing with. And we are working every single day to get as much food to support those efforts as we possibly can because of our recognition of the disaster on the ground, because of the humanitarian catastrophe, every single day working toward it.